The sun has left and forgotten me. It's dark, I cannot see.
Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief storymaker at Elkins Consulting. Whether you're telling stories in person, online, on any platform, whether they're for work or for personal conversation, your stories matter. The stories you tell say a lot about who you are. And the stories you tell about other people say even more about who you are. Today's guest is my friend, Mandy Hoskinson, and I'm so excited for our listeners today because you are in for a treat. She calls herself Media Mandy, and you will find out in the first 15 minutes of our conversation. Mandy, thank you so much for joining me on Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will.
Thank you. Always excited to chat and always excited to learn more from hosts as well.
Well, and isn't that fascinating? I learned so much from my clients and from being a guest on other people's podcasts. So I really appreciate that you just said that.
Yeah, it happens every single time.
Definitely. So, I give you a heads up in advance. The first question I love to ask my guests. I love for our guests to share something about themselves that most people might not know.
I tell my story a lot. But either way, I'm a military kid. I lived in 13 states before I settled in California. And I think as a marketer, it requires a lot of empathy. And I think that gives me a sort of unique perspective on people and how different people operate. I didn't grow up in a bubble. I grew up with lots of different types of people, and that helps me in my day-to-day job.
That makes so much sense to me, especially because my husband is a Navy brat and he moved all over the world. So he definitely has a different perspective about how people think and culturally the differences. So tell me, when you think about moving around probably every 2 to 3 years, when you think about one of the moves that was especially hard, where you really had to make adjustments that were a little less anticipated than usual, you're already nodding your head. Our listeners can't see it, but I can see you nodding your head. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, I moved from Kansas to California, and we moved every 6 to 18 months. So it was really fast.
Wow.
And I moved from Kansas to California. And I think the biggest part of that was the diversity of people. I moved to Long Beach, which has the highest concentration of Cambodian people, a lot of Vietnamese people, but they live just south, outside of their home country. And a number of other countries have some of the most people outside their home country in that area. And I didn't know about Cambodia. I didn't know about the Khmer Rouge. I didn't know about a lot of the history, and that history impacted my school friends. It was recent history. And there was a lot of learning about people's backgrounds and people's history that had to happen just to relate to my new friends.
I can imagine that would be such a huge culture change. I remember moving from Los Angeles. I went to elementary school in LA to Colorado Springs. So I moved from a very diverse location to a very not diverse, very homogenous location. And I remember that seemed like a culture shock. And then moving from Washington, D.C., which is where I moved right after college and spending 5 years there, and then moving to Montana, again, it's like this huge shift. Do you, when you think about that shift into Long Beach and that very diverse crowd, is there another shift that happened in your brain when you went from being in the corporate world, working for someone else, to doing your own thing? I know based on your LinkedIn profile that it was a gradual thing. You had the side hustle thing going, which I relate to because I did the same thing. But I do remember a very distinct mindset shift when I went exclusively self-employed. So can you tell me about how maybe that relates to your shifts in how you had to adjust into the new location going to Long Beach?
Yeah. It's a great question. I was just camping with friends for 2 weeks, and this is something that someone challenged me to think about was identity. And I have four friends that all come from the same small town, and they all took different routes, and they're now in their 30s. And it's interesting to see how their lives are panning out from those routes. Like one person, which is how I met them, went to UCLA with me, became a scientist. One person hustles and has a tech job in San Francisco. One person traveled for 10 years and is now settling down. And then one person stayed in their hometown and is taking over their father's sign business as a third generation artist. And it's interesting to see these because I relate to every single one of their journeys. And I was kind of on, sort of in many ways, like on each one. And I think we all choose a path, or hopefully don't let a path just choose you. And in big cities, people fantasize about smaller, slower lives, or not smaller, but slower, right? Like smaller communities, slower lives. So many people here will say they want to live on a farm, and I just laugh in their face. Because they don't. But I get it. I get it. And there's a lot of competition here. Competition makes life expensive. It makes social interactions kind of strange. And I was reflecting on how I can incorporate slowness in my life. And I think that comes from being in places where people are more sane and more kind because they have chosen a life where they're not overwhelmed all the time. And you can still choose that busy life anywhere, and you can still choose a peaceful life anywhere. But if your environment encourages it, and if your community encourages it, that can really help. And so I am choosing in the next couple of months to incorporate slowness instead of sort of just following the environment around me of speed and competition.
I love that, Mandy. That is so incredibly insightful because we all know how the environment can drive our emotional well-being and our schedules and how our anxiety rises and falls. And now I understand why Robert Downs introduced us more than before. So Robert Downs, for our listeners, is a phenomenal rock star photographer, literally a rock star photographer in LA. And I met him years ago at one of my first big keynotes that was in Ontario, which is just outside of Los Angeles. And I kept asking Robert to come visit me in Montana. And I'd say, you are just going to love it here. You're going to want to take a ton of pictures. And he would, for 5 years, I would invite him. And he would say, it's not really my thing. I'm not a landscape artist. Like, I don't do photography in nature, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you will be so amazed at how inspired you'll get to take photographs when you get here. Well, it didn't happen for the longest time, 5 years. And finally, 2020. And even the first part of the shutdown didn't make him want to come here. It was when the riots started in Long Beach that he decided that, okay, maybe Montana would be a good place to spend a little time. And he came out and we had a ball together. I took him floating on the Missouri River. I took him on this ridiculously long and beautiful hike on Mount Helena, right behind my house in Helena. And one thing he said that was really interesting to me was that what he saw differently in Montana wasn't just, where we are in terms of the beauty of our surroundings, but the lifestyle of people being real, being authentic in whatever way that looks for them, which I believe is an ever-changing thing, your identity, your authenticity. But one of the things he said was that it's really hard to meet people in LA that have that mentality.